The hum of the deep space array was a lullaby, a constant companion to my solitary vigils. For decades, Blake Mortimer, had sought echoes in the celestial silence, sifting through the cosmos for the whisper of a distant breath, the faintest flicker of life on a star-dusted sphere. My observatory, a meticulously arranged sanctuary of screens and consoles, was both my prison and my liberation, a place where the universe unfolded in streams of data. My existence was predicated on logic, on the elegant predictability of physics, on the beautiful, brutal indifference of the void. It began subtly, a faint tremor in the data stream, an aberrant spike on the primary sensor array. I'd seen such anomalies countless times, usually dismissed as cosmic ray interference or a minor instrumental drift. I adjusted the spectral filters, tightened the parameters on the gravitational lensing algorithms, and recalibrated the primary antenna array, a ritual born of long habit and scientific rigor. The anomaly persisted. A flicker of annoyance, then a prickle of professional curiosity, stirred within me. I leaned closer to the main display, my gaze tracing the jagged line that defied expectation. It wasn't random noise, there was a periodicity to it, a subtle, almost rhythmic undulation beneath the static. My fingers danced across the holographic interface, isolating the aberrant frequency, amplifying it, running it through a series of diagnostic protocols designed to strip away any terrestrial interference. The signal sharpened, a distinct pattern emerging from the cosmic static. My breath hitched. The data wasn't just a blip, it was a pulse. Not the steady, predictable thrum of a pulsar, nor the chaotic burst of a gamma-ray event. This was something else entirely. I cross-referenced it with known astrophysical phenomena, running algorithms against every catalogued celestial event. Nothing matched. The pattern was intricate, layered, like a complex waveform, yet strangely organic in its cadence. It was a rhythm that spoke of something internal, something alive. My mind, a fortress of scientific skepticism, immediately began constructing explanations. Equipment malfunction. Software glitch. A previously uncatalogued, highly unusual stellar phenomenon. I ran a complete system diagnostic, watched the green lines confirming optimal performance, then rerouted the signal through a secondary, independent array. The pulse remained, unwavering, identical. Impossible, I muttered, the word a dry rasp in the quiet room. I pinpointed the origin. My coordinates flashed on the auxiliary screen, identifying a sector of space I knew intimately. It wasn't a stellar emission. It wasn't planetary. The frequency range, the amplitude variations, the subtle, complex fluctuations, they screamed of biological activity, a vast, slow heartbeat resonating across unimaginable distances. My hands trembled as I ran the data through a biosignature analysis program, a tool usually reserved for theoretical models of extremophile life on distant, water-rich worlds. The results flashed, bold and undeniable, high probability of complex organic structure. This wasn't just an anomaly, it was an affront to everything I understood about the universe. The signal intensified, not in volume, but in its clarity, its undeniable presence. I spent the next several hours in a frantic dance with my instruments, trying to break the signal, to find its flaw, its logical deception. I filtered, isolated, inverted, amplified, but the biological pulse remained, a persistent, undeniable thrum. Each failed attempt to debunk it chipped away at my certainty, replacing it with a growing, unsettling conviction. This was real. And it was impossible. leaving the observatory in the pre-dawn quiet, the familiar world outside felt subtly altered. The air, usually crisp and bracing, seemed heavier, imbued with a strange density. I walked the deserted streets, the rhythmic clang of my own footsteps suddenly echoing the cosmic pulse still vibrating in my mind. I found myself drawn towards the edge of town, to the sprawling, metallic skeleton of the railway depot. The vast expanse of tracks, the silent, hulking carriages, the skeletal gantries stretching into the gray light, it had always been a place of quiet industry, of predictable departures and arrivals. But tonight, it felt different. The geometric patterns of the girders, the intricate latticework of the tracks, seemed to resolve into something more complex, fractal, almost alive. My eyes traced patterns where none should exist, seeing a subtle, shimmering energy in the rust-pitted steel, a hidden pulse beneath the grime. It was as if the signal had not just entered my instruments, but had begun to subtly rewire my very perception, grafting new layers onto the mundane. The universe, I had always believed, was indifferent. But this signal. It felt less like indifference and more like a vast, ancient eye slowly opening, and its gaze, I realized with a sickening jolt, was fixed squarely on me. Now, I understood why. The signal was calling. And I was already answering. The hum that had been a lullaby now felt like a low, resonant thrum against the bone behind my ears. My observatory, a fortress of solitude perched on the high plains, had become a battleground. Each diagnostic protocol I ran, each calibration sequence I initiated, was a weapon against the burgeoning absurdity. I recalibrated the primary reflector, a dish the size of a small house, then the secondary array, a nest of polished steel and intricate wiring. I checked for solar flares, for terrestrial interference, for the subtle whispers of distant quasars mimicking something they were not. Nothing. The void where no stars should sing continued its rhythmic pulse, a biological beat against the fabric of the universe, growing bolder, more insistent. The first subtle shift came with the coffee. A familiar ritual, the steaming mug in my hands, its rich aroma usually a comforting anchor. But as I lifted it, the scent of roasted beans seemed to vibrate with the same low thrum as the signal. I dismissed it, attributing it to fatigue, a trick of overworked nerves. I hadn't slept properly since the anomaly first presented itself. My attempts to debunk the signal bled into my waking hours, staining the mundane. The rhythmic clicking of the cooling fans in the server room began to sync with the pulse, a mechanical heartbeat echoing the impossible biological one. I'd snapped my head up, convinced I'd missed something, some subtle shift in the data stream, only to find the readout stubbornly consistent, the impossible signal unwavering. Driven by a need for a specific, obscure filter I knew was only stocked at a specialist electronics warehouse across the city, I left the observatory. The drive was a blur of highway and simmering frustration. I needed to clear my head, to ground myself in the tangible world, away from the sterile glow of my screens. The air here was thick with the scent of creosote and damp earth, a stark contrast to the rarefied atmosphere of my mountaintop sanctuary. I walked among the hulking silhouettes of derelict locomotives, their paint peeling like sunburnt skin. As I passed a particularly massive, rusted engine, a sudden, piercing clang echoed from within one of the sheds, a worker, perhaps, or just the wind rattling loose metal. But the sound wasn't just auditory. It was a flash of incandescent orange behind my eyes, a sharp, coppery taste that coated my tongue. My knees buckled slightly, a jolt of disorientation. Stress, I told myself, pure, unadulterated stress. I watched a single, grimy pigeon peck at a discarded crumb near my feet. Its movements seemed unnaturally precise, each bob of its head a tiny, perfect oscillation. The gray feathers on its back shimmered with an almost imperceptible, iridescent sheen that held the same underlying rhythm as the signal. The world was subtly, terrifyingly, changing around me. Back at the observatory, the night brought no reprieve. Sleep, when it finally came, was a fractured tapestry of unease. My dreams were no longer the gentle, abstract wanderings of a tired mind. I saw impossible geometries unfold in the blackness, structures that defied Euclidean space, and the rhythmic pulse of the signal was the basso profundo of this cosmic symphony. The glowing clock on my nightstand read 3:17 a.m. The signal wasn't just data, it was a presence, and it was watching. The pigeon, a drab sentinel on the cracked pavement, continued its ritualistic pecking. Each dip of its head, each minute shift of its weight, described an arc, not random, but deeply, impossibly ordered. I saw it then, not just the rhythmic bob from yesterday, but a geometry within the flutter of its wings, a tiny, intricate spiral unfurling from the base of each feather. It was the signal, translated, made manifest in flesh and bone. The drab gray became a canvas, vibrating with unseen patterns that whispered of infinite recursion. The chipped paint on my coffee mug, the steam rising from its surface, the grain in the wooden desk, all began to reveal a hidden order, a self-similar complexity that defied the chaos of everyday existence. It was as if a veil had been drawn back, revealing the skeletal structure beneath reality's skin. The world around me was not just composed of atoms and energy, but of these repeating, interlocking symmetries, like an endless mosaic whose tiles were themselves smaller, perfect versions of the whole. My vision sharpened, yet simultaneously blurred, as my mind struggled to reconcile what I knew with what I was seeing. The fluorescent lights in the observation chamber hummed, and I could almost hear the patterns in their whine. "Blake," a colleague's voice cut through the hum, sharp as a broken shard. "Are you seeing this? The gamma ray burst from Cygnus X1 is off the charts." I turned, my eyes still struggling to refocus from the fractal tapestry of the air itself. "Cygnus X1?" I murmured, the name feeling distant, irrelevant. "No, I was observing something else." The colleague, a sharp-featured woman with an impatient air, peered at me over her spectacles. "Observing what, exactly? Your coffee cup? You've been staring at it for 5 minutes." Her tone was edged with a familiar skepticism, a subtle tightening around her mouth that spoke volumes. "Look, I know you're deep into that anomaly, but we have real data coming in. We need your analysis, not whatever this is." She gestured vaguely at my preoccupied posture, at the disarray of my thoughts. I tried to explain, to articulate the crystalline structures forming in the dust motes dancing in the light, the echoing geometries in the very fabric of the room. "The patterns," I began, my voice hoarse. "They're everywhere. The signal, it's not just sound, it's a design. It's in the way light refracts, in the growth of things, even in the decay." She blinked, her expression shifting from impatience to something colder, more dismissive. "Blake, are you feeling all right? You look exhausted. Perhaps a break would do you good. This obsession with your dead sector pulse is becoming unproductive." The unspoken unhealthy hung in the air, a phantom word that stung. She turned back to her console, her attention already elsewhere, a door closing softly but firmly in my face. My determination, however, only solidified. They couldn't see it, but I could. I had to. My dreams were no longer fragmented echoes of my waking anxieties, they were coherent, vivid, and terrifyingly real. Vast, unblinking eyes, not eyes made of flesh or light, but of pure, indifferent scale, watched me from an unimaginable distance. There was no malevolence, only an absolute, crushing indifference that rendered my existence, my planet, my entire solar system, less than a speck of dust. One night, the dream was so potent it bled into my waking. I rose before dawn, compelled by an invisible hand, and found myself walking towards the city's edge. The air was damp, heavy with the scent of rain and rust. The destination was clear, though my conscious mind had not chosen it, the old railway depot. The vast iron skeleton of the main shed loomed against the bruised sky. Rust-eaten locomotives sat like slumbering beasts, their metal skins flaking away in crimson scales. The peeling paint on a forgotten freight car shimmered with an impossible geometry, each crack and blister a miniature spiral. The riveted plates of the steel beams, the intricate latticework of the support structures, the very dust on the grimy windows, all of it vibrated with the signal's intricate design. It was a symphony of recursive forms, a visual echo of the impossible pulse. The texture, the decay, the way the light caught the microscopic irregularities, it all conformed to the pattern. My fingers tingled, a faint, almost electrical current passing through me. This was not a hallucination, this was a revelation. The signal was not merely an external phenomenon I observed through instruments. It was an instruction, a blueprint, subtly re-etching the very perceptual apparatus of my mind. My dreams were not just dreams, they were glimpses into a deeper reality, a cosmic unconsciousness that was now actively communicating, reshaping my understanding of time and existence. The indifference I sensed from the ancient entities was not a judgment, but simply their inherent nature. They existed, vast and unfathomable, and their existence was now bleeding into mine. I was being called, awakened, not just to knowledge, but to a terrifying intimacy with forces that predated thought itself. The old Blake, the rational astrophysicist, was slowly dissolving, replaced by something else. Her words, unproductive, had been a blade of ice. I saw the judgment in her eyes, the way her lips thinned, and a tremor ran through me that had nothing to do with the chill of the lab. It was the signal, I knew, burrowing deeper, making her dismissal feel like a physical blow, a cosmic rejection. The faint hum in my ears intensified, a low thrum that was no longer just a sound, but a vibration in my very bones, resonating with the impossible pulse from the dead sector. Sleep offered no respite, only an invitation to a deeper, more unsettling reality. My dreams became vast, formless landscapes under alien, indifferent skies, populated by shadows that stretched beyond comprehension. The coffee cup on my desk, the worn binding of a textbook, each object pulsed with a faint, internal light, revealing geometries too complex, too perfect for anything fashioned by human hands. The conventional paths had yielded nothing but skepticism and pity. My colleagues saw only a man unraveling, not a man seeing too much. But the signal, now, was a direct address, a call meant for me alone. It twisted my logic, urging me to seek answers where logic feared to tread. If the universe had a secret, it wasn't in peer-reviewed journals. My search led me, inevitably, to the railway depot. Not the bustling passenger terminal, but a forgotten annex, a skeletal structure of rusted iron and flaking paint tucked away behind a maze of active tracks. The air here was thick with the scent of coal dust, creosote, and the damp earth beneath rotting ties. This particular section, a vast, dimly lit expanse, was rumored to house not only defunct machinery but also the city's discarded archives, the detritus of generations too busy to sort through the past. I found the entrance to the archival section behind a stack of enormous, corroded engine parts. A heavy, grimy canvas tarp, stiff with age, served as a makeshift door. Shelf after shelf of dusty boxes, forgotten ledgers, and bundled newspapers stretched into the gloom. My hands, guided by an instinct that felt less like my own and more like an impulse from the signal itself, traced the spines of ancient tomes. I wasn't looking for astrophysics journals, I was looking for the irrational, the suppressed. After what felt like hours, my fingers brushed against a collection of unbound manuscripts, their covers brittle, their pages yellowed and foxed. This was it. I pulled it from the shelf, dust motes exploding into the weak light. Inside, the script was faded, archaic, but legible. I devoured the words, my eyes scanning for familiar echoes. Dot in the sky wept a soundless rain, a resonance that plucked the strings of the mind until they snapped. Then, they simply ceased to be. Vanished. They saw patterns in the mundane, heard voices in the static, before succumbing to a collective delusion that ended in mass disappearances, leaving behind only empty villages and a lingering sense of profound wrongness. My fingers trembled as I turned a page, a fine powder of ancient paper clinging to my skin. The signal in my head intensified, a low, resonant thrum that seemed to align perfectly with the unsettling narrative unfolding before me. It wasn't just a data point anymore, it was an ancestral horror, a recurring nightmare woven into the tapestry of human history. This wasn't merely about distant stars or impossible signals. It was about consciousness itself, a fragile vessel susceptible to an influence so vast, so alien, that it could unravel reality from within. The knowledge I had sought was here, laid bare in these forgotten texts, and it was far more terrifying than any blank space on a star chart. The brittle texts, unearthed from forgotten digital archives, became my new liturgy. Each antique account of celestial cadence and unmade senses was a mirror, reflecting my own spiraling perception. My office, once a sanctuary of ordered thought, devolved into a warren of hastily printed papers and flickering screens. The scent of stale coffee mingled with the metallic tang of ozone from overstressed equipment. They were not just visual distortions, they were assertions, insistent whispers of a deeper, more complex reality that mocked the tidy equations I had once revered. Blake. He stood framed in my doorway, a silhouette of disapproval, his arms crossed over a crisp shirt. His eyes, though I couldn't discern their color from the angle, felt like dull instruments probing a wound. The data is crucial, I began, my voice raspy, a stranger's utterance. It corroborates the historical accounts. This isn't just a faint pulse, it's a resonant frequency, a pattern of intent. The department head sighed, a sound like a deflating bladder. Intent, Blake? We're talking about a statistical anomaly in a dead sector. Your latest paper reads less like astrophysics and more like a fever dream. They couldn't see it, or perhaps, they wouldn't. They're blind, I countered, the words tasting like ash. Or worse, they're part of the inertia. The mechanism that keeps us from seeing. My gaze drifted to the monitors, where the undulating waveform of the signal pulsed with an almost organic rhythm. The University Council is reviewing your position. Your colleagues are concerned. Concerned that I'm seeing what they're too afraid to acknowledge? I pushed back, a raw edge to my voice. This isn't just a signal, it's a caller. It's been reaching out for centuries, and each time, humanity has found a way to dismiss it, to bury the evidence, to forget. It's a vast, ancient conspiracy of ignorance, or perhaps a natural law, a cosmic filter, preventing us from truly perceiving the magnitude of what lies beyond. The words tumbled out, a confession and a challenge, fueled by the relentless thrum in my skull. The department head stared at me, his face a mask of weary resignation. Blake, I suggest you take some time. Step away from the data. Re-evaluate. He turned, his departure a definitive period at the end of a sentence. The door clicked shut, sealing me in my self-made prison of revelation. They wouldn't understand. They couldn't. The world outside, with its mundane concerns and its neatly categorized knowledge, was a flimsy veil. My professional life, once the anchor of my existence, crumbled like ancient masonry. Emails piled up, calls went unanswered. I retreated, not just from the university, but from the world. My apartment became a secondary lab, filled with scavenged electronics, custom-built receivers, and a growing stack of obscure historical texts. The walls of my apartment began to feel too thin, too porous. I needed a space where the caller's voice could resonate unhindered, a place untainted by the chatter of human dismissal. My search led me to the edge of the city, to a derelict railway depot. It was a skeletal cathedral of rust and forgotten industry, a sprawling expanse of disused tracks and silent loading bays. The air here was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying metal, a perfect counterpoint to the sterile hum of my equipment. The main building, a cavernous structure with a collapsing roof, offered a strange, isolated sanctuary. Dust motes, thick as snowflakes, danced in the shafts of light that pierced the broken skylights, each illuminated particle a tiny, fleeting fractal. I began moving my modified equipment in, piece by laborious piece. The heavy generator, the intricate antenna array I'd cobbled together, the bank of monitors that would display the caller's rhythmic pulse. Here, the signal felt clearer, less diluted by the cacophony of human denial. As I set up the last monitor, its screen glowed with the familiar, mesmerizing waveform. The caller was here, with me, in this forgotten place. The paranoia, once a nascent fear, now solidified into an undeniable truth. They were watching, waiting, and I was the only one who could hear the call. The security officer, a man whose face was a landscape of weary skepticism, had merely shaken his head, his gaze a mixture of pity and professional dismissal. They preferred their tidy explanations, their scientific boundaries unbreached by the truly impossible. But the signal, the relentless, rhythmic pulse from the void, respected no such fences. It had already breached mine. I found myself adrift in a boundless, black ocean, the water slick and cold, yet strangely viscous, like liquid night. Above me, not stars, but impossible geometries of light pulsed with a silent, terrible energy. They weren't constellations, they were the bare, exposed nerve endings of existence, throbbing with a rhythm that was both alien and sickeningly familiar. A colossal shadow moved beneath the surface, stirring the dark waters, not with fins or limbs, but with an immense, unhurried displacement of absolute nothingness. I felt no fear, only an overwhelming, crushing insignificance, a complete and utter cosmic indifference that threatened to flatten my very soul. I stared at the chipped paint on the wall, and for a fleeting, horrifying moment, the cracks seemed to deepen, to branch into the very fractal designs I had just witnessed. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and the illusion vanished, leaving behind only the mundane reality of peeling paint. But the memory of the vision lingered, a sticky residue on my perception. The line was blurring, dissolving like ink in water. Determined to ground myself, I left the room, needing to move, to seek out the historical accounts I'd begun to uncover. The streets were a dull gray under an overcast sky, the city's usual hum feeling muted, almost hushed. I passed a woman pushing a pram, her eyes, usually darting with the hurried anxiety of urban life, were fixed, unblinking, on some distant point beyond the horizon. Her expression was utterly blank, a shared vacant stare that resonated with the cosmic indifference from my dream. Further on, a group of workers stood by a construction site, their tools lying idle. They weren't talking, weren't moving, just gazing upwards, their faces turned towards the gray sky with an unnerving, collective stillness. It was fleeting, a moment that passed almost before I could fully register it, but it was there, a subtle shift in the human landscape, a shared vacancy that prickled the hairs on my neck. It was beginning to hum in the periphery of everyone else's awareness. My destination was an old industrial archive, tucked away near the city's sprawling railway depot. The depot itself was a labyrinth of rusting tracks, hulking warehouses, and skeletal gantry cranes that clawed at the sky. A perpetual pall of diesel fumes and metallic tang hung heavy in the air. As I approached, the rhythmic clang of shunting cars, usually a comforting backdrop of industry, seemed to fall into a strange, off-kilter syncopation, almost like a heartbeat struggling to find its pace. The depot was busier than I expected, a constant flow of freight handlers, engineers, and maintenance crews. Yet, amidst the activity, the unsettling stillness I'd observed earlier became more pronounced. A group of freight handlers were stacking crates, their movements precise, almost robotic, their eyes wide and unblinking, reflecting the dull gray sky like polished stones. One of them, a burly man with a grease-stained cap, paused, his arms laden with a heavy box. He didn't drop the box, didn't falter, but his head tilted, just slightly, as if listening to a sound beyond the range of human hearing. His gaze, usually directed at his task, drifted upwards, locking onto the distant, skeletal framework of a defunct signal tower. For a long, drawn-out moment, he stood perfectly still, the box held aloft, his vacant stare fixed on the tower's rusted metal, which, to my own eyes, now seemed to shimmer with an impossible, fleeting geometry, a faint echo of the dream's patterns. It wasn't just my perception fracturing, it was spreading. The signal was a contagion, not of the body, but of the mind, a subtle rewiring of reality that was beginning to manifest in the collective consciousness. The man finally lowered the box, his movements resuming their mechanical rhythm, but the image of his upward gaze, that shared, empty stare, was now seared into my memory. The world wasn't just showing me its secrets, it was beginning to reveal the slow, horrifying process of its own unraveling, starting with the minds of those who walked its surface. I was not alone in witnessing the impossible, but I was perhaps the only one who truly understood what it meant. And the understanding was a burden that threatened to crush me. The railway depot, a skeletal monument to forgotten journeys, exhaled the frigid breath of iron and disuse. Rust-scaled tracks, like fossilized veins, stretched into the gloom of the massive shed, vanishing beneath the skeletal remains of what might have once been carriages. A vast, echoing vault of silence, it was here I sought refuge, my mind a crucible of raw data and frayed nerves, the distant city's pulse a muffled drum against the profound quietude. My earlier conviction, that the cosmos itself was enacting a colossal, ancient deception, had solidified into a chilling certainty, a truth I now clutched like a cold, sharp stone. The security officer, a man whose weary eyes held the dull sheen of too many late shifts, had simply nodded when I'd explained my need for uninterrupted observation. He saw a man lost in his own intricate world, I suppose, not one teetering on the precipice of an unraveling universe. My makeshift equipment, an array of modified sensors and a heavily shielded receiver, hummed softly on a rickety workbench. But tonight, it was different. I leaned closer to the receiver, my breath misting in the cold air. The display flickered, the familiar waveform now jagged, erratic, as if struggling to contain a boundless energy. Then, the sound shifted. No longer a pulse, but a sustained, low-frequency hum, a guttural drone that seemed to bypass my ears entirely and resonate directly within my consciousness. It was a pressure, like deep ocean currents pressing against a fragile submersible, threatening to buckle the hull of my mind. And then, it came. Not words, not language, but concepts. Raw, unmediated understanding, flooding my thoughts with a terrifying clarity. The first was scale. A crushing, incomprehensible vastness. My mind was shown not a galaxy, but the idea of a galaxy, an ephemeral swirl in an infinite blackness where other galaxies were less than motes of dust, and the space between them was truly, utterly empty. Not empty of matter, but empty of meaning. I saw the universe as a vast, indifferent mechanism, its gears turning with no purpose, its existence a self-perpetuating, meaningless hum. Humanity, our sun, our entire terrestrial history, became a fleeting spark, extinguished before it truly ignited, utterly insignificant. My hands trembled, gripping the cold metal edge of the workbench, as the truth of our cosmic triviality settled like a shroud. Next came indifference. The signal wasn't a warning, it was merely being. It revealed the dead sector of space not as lifeless, but as a region where the very concept of life as we understood it was irrelevant. It showed me formations of unimaginable size, not stars, but structures, ancient and colossal, existing outside the familiar physics of light and gravity. These were not built, but were. A wave of vertigo swept over me, and I stumbled back, catching myself against a stack of rusted metal crates. The concepts were relentless, burrowing deeper, revealing a horrifying truth about the entity itself. It was sentience, but a sentience utterly alien, without motive or emotion, driven by an inherent, slow-burning will to simply be. It had no desire to communicate, no need for connection. Its call was not an invitation, but a byproduct of its vast, awakening presence. And it was aware of me. Not as an individual, but as a tiny, fleeting point of disturbance in its periphery, a microscopic ripple on the surface of its cosmic awareness. My search, my desperate probing, had not been an act of discovery, but an act of being seen, however briefly, by something truly ancient and boundless. The air in the railway depot grew heavy, thick with the unvoiced truths that now resonated in my mind. My determination, once a fiery beacon, now flickered, threatened by the icy winds of revelation. I was not a seeker of knowledge, I was a receiver of an unsought, terrifying burden. The universe was not just indifferent, it was actively, overwhelmingly other. It was a presence, now, a silent observer within my own thoughts, waiting. Here, amidst the ghosts of locomotion, I found the only privacy left to me, the only place where the world's insistent, shallow frequencies could not quite penetrate. My hands, raw and trembling, moved with a frantic precision born of pure obsession. The device, my desperate creation, was a grotesque assemblage of scavenged parts, tarnished copper coils from an old power transformer, a nest of delicate vacuum tubes salvaged from antique radio sets, and a polished obsidian disc that had once served as a decorative paperweight. I had wired it all to a modified frequency generator, its analog dials worn smooth by my relentless adjustments. It hummed with a low, expectant thrum, a sympathetic vibration to the one already resonating within my bones. This wasn't about listening anymore, it was about tuning. "Almost there," I whispered, the words rasping in the cold air, tasting of metal and dust. My reflection in a grimy windowpane showed a gaunt, wild-eyed stranger, a man stretched taut by sleepless nights and the relentless pressure of an unanswerable question. My fingers, stained with solder flux and grime, tightened a final connection. The choice, if it ever truly was one, had been made long ago. I placed the obsidian disc against my temple, its surface cool and slick against my skin, the embedded wires trailing like neural extensions. The air around me thickened, growing heavy, like breathing liquid. The rusted girders of the railway depot began to waver, their solid lines softening, blurring at the edges. The skeletal carriages seemed to breathe, their empty windows like the eyes of ancient, forgotten things. Then, the signal hit me, not as a sound, but as an overwhelming presence. It was a tide of pure, unadulterated information, washing over me, through me, stripping away the thin veneer of my human perception. The rhythmic pulse, which I had only ever perceived as a frequency, became a vast, intricate pattern, a living geometry that unfolded in dimensions I had no framework to comprehend. It wasn't empty. It was full. Full of an immense, silent, indifferent existence. The entity wasn't a thing, not a creature with limbs or eyes, but a fundamental principle, a cosmic algorithm, a slow, inexorable becoming. Its purpose wasn't malevolent, nor benevolent, it simply was. I saw patterns in the rust on the tracks, fractals within fractals, infinite depth in a single fleck of paint. The depot itself was not just metal and concrete, but a temporary configuration of energy, momentarily stable, soon to be reabsorbed into the larger, flowing tapestry of existence. My mind reeled, grasping at anchors that no longer held. The sense of scale was crushing. My individual existence, my entire species, our planet, our sun, we were less than motes of dust, insignificant ripples on an ocean whose depths were unfathomable. The entity wasn't calling me, it was simply being, and I, through my desperate device, had merely opened myself to its resonant frequency. It was waking, yes, but not in any way I had conceived. It was waking through us, within us, its presence a slow, insidious bloom in the collective unconscious, a repatterning of the very neural pathways that define our reality. A searing pain lanced through my temples. My vision swam, the familiar world dissolving into shimmering, overlapping planes. My teeth ached, my jaw clenching involuntarily. I was unraveling. The delicate threads of my sanity, already frayed, snapped one by one, releasing me into an ocean of pure, undifferentiated sensation. I tore the obsidian disc from my head, a raw cry escaping my lips, a sound swallowed by the echoing vastness of the depot. The device sputtered, then went silent, plunging the world back into a fragile, familiar quiet. But the silence was a lie. The patterns remained, etched into my retina, burned into my consciousness. The railway depot, for all its solid appearance, now seemed translucent, a temporary illusion. My hands trembled violently, my legs giving way, and I crumpled to the grimy concrete floor, gasping for breath, the taste of ozone and ash thick in my mouth. I had seen. I had understood. And the knowledge was a poison, dissolving the very ground beneath my feet. I stood amidst it all, my breath pluming in the raw air, the chill seeping into my marrow. My fingers, numb despite the thick gloves, fumbled with the worn edges of the ancient map, its creases deepened by countless unfoldings. The signal, a phantom limb ache in my skull for weeks, began to thrum with renewed intensity. It vibrated not just in my ears, but through the soles of my boots, up my spine, blooming behind my eyes like a bruised flower. My voice sounded thin, alien. The truth of my pursuit had led me to this derelict space, to this precipice of understanding, and I would not falter. I opened my eyes, and the world had changed. The rust-scaled tracks no longer lay inert, they writhed, not physically, but perceptually, their fractal edges blossoming into intricate, impossible patterns that defied the geometry of steel. The very air shimmered, a viscous medium revealing layers of reality I had never known existed. It was as if a thin, familiar membrane had been peeled back, exposing the raw, seething tissue beneath. The rhythmic pulse, the biological hum I had first detected, now resonated in every atom of my being. My sight blurred, then sharpened, not to greater detail, but to a different kind of vision. I saw the depot not as solid matter, but as a fleeting arrangement of energy, a temporary illusion against a backdrop of crushing, eternal consciousness. The unveiling began not with a roar, but with a profound, terrifying presence. It was not a physical manifestation, no lumbering form or spectral shroud. Instead, the entity revealed itself as the fundamental truth of existence, a truth that ripped through the fragile tapestry of my understanding like paper. The air in the vast shed became a canvas for something ancient, something that had always been. I saw, or rather felt, the universe as a singular, colossal organism, not made of stars and nebulae, but of thought, of an indifferent, unfathomable awareness. My knees buckled. The fractal patterns that had once been a curious anomaly in my vision now formed the very threads of reality, weaving and unweaving, each point a node in a boundless, living network. I perceived the universe not as inert space, but as a vast, pulsating mind, its thoughts the cosmic phenomena I had spent my life studying. The stars were not distant suns, they were the fevered synapses of something beyond dimension, beyond time. Humanity, with all its striving and its noise, was less than a single, unheeded thought in its infinite, alien dream. I saw the ancient, vast entities not with my eyes, but with a mind suddenly unmoored from its earthly constraints. They were not creatures in a conventional sense, but fundamental principles, colossal currents of consciousness that shaped the very laws of physics, the architects of this living, breathing, indifferent reality. Their forms were concepts, their presence a pressure that flattened all human meaning. My understanding of reality shattered, splintering into a million impossible fragments. The world I knew, the rational, ordered cosmos of equations and observable phenomena, was a child's drawing, hastily scribbled over a masterpiece of incomprehensible horror. I was a man who had pulled back the curtain, not to reveal a wizard, but to find the stage itself was a living, sentient entity, and its play was not for me. The vision began to recede, not gently, but violently, like a tide pulling back from a ravaged shore. The fractal patterns dissolved, the breathing carriages settled back into inert rust, the air thinned to its usual frigid bite. But the knowledge, the terrible, undeniable truth, remained. It was a brand seared into my very soul, an understanding that would never allow me to see the world as I once had. The cosmos was alive, and it was calling. My breath plumed in the cold air, each exhalation a ghostly wisp against the colossal, shadowed shapes of disused locomotives. They loomed like slumbering leviathans, their metal skins flaking, their windows shattered, eyes staring into an eternity of rust. I walked among them, my footsteps crunching on loose gravel, each sound amplified, distorted, echoing back to me not as a simple return, but as a complex, repeating pattern, a fractal echo. The world had become a kaleidoscope of meaning, every surface a canvas for the entity's whispers. The rust on a forgotten engine's boiler was not random decay, it was a map, a branching diagram of alien consciousness. The words felt alien, not entirely mine. The presence, the signal, it pulsed stronger here, a biological rhythm in a place of dead machines. It had drawn me, a moth to a flame visible only to a mind already singed. It wasn't just a signal anymore, it was a language, a direct communion. I felt it not as thought, but as a pervasive understanding, seeping into the marrow of my being, rewriting the very syntax of my consciousness. It was here, now, pressed against the raw nerve endings of my frayed sanity. The entity offered an end to the struggle, a cessation of the terrifying dissonance that had become my waking life. It offered ultimate knowledge, a complete dissolution into its vast, indifferent consciousness. I saw it, not with my eyes, but with a deeper, internal vision, the cosmic dance of creation and decay, the intricate, beautiful horror of reality stripped bare. To succumb would be to join it, to become a part of its eternal, unknowable purpose. The temptation was immense, a siren song promising peace from the relentless torment. My mind, a tattered sail in a hurricane, yearned for that calm. But then, a flicker. A memory, perhaps, or a stubborn residue of the man I once was. The faces of colleagues, the quiet hum of the observatory, the simple joy of a clear night sky. They were distant, almost meaningless against the overwhelming scale of the entity, yet they persisted. A desperate, almost futile defiance rose within me. Could I fight this? How does one fight a concept, a fundamental aspect of reality? My mind raced, searching for an anchor, a weapon. A scientific instrument? A theory? They were toys, dust against a storm. Yet, the thought of simply surrendering, of letting the last vestiges of Blake Mortimer dissolve, was a horror almost greater than the entity itself. And then, the third path, a desperate, almost laughable notion, to warn them. To warn them of a pulse that reshaped perception, of an entity that communicated through the very fabric of reality. Who would listen? How could I articulate the horror, the beauty, the sheer wrongness of it all, without sounding like a raving prophet of doom? They would dismiss me, confine me, label me. My name, Blake Mortimer, would become a footnote in the annals of forgotten eccentrics. But the thought, however impossible, held a fragile thread of hope. The railway depot breathed around me, the creaks and groans of settling metal becoming the entity's own language, a bass thrum beneath the shimmering, fractal patterns that now overlaid my vision. My eyes traced the lines of rust, saw the impossible geometry in the peeling paint. The choice hung heavy, a cosmic weight upon my soul. Succumb and find peace in dissolution? Fight and be crushed into oblivion? The metal felt alive, buzzing with the impossible signal. The distinction between inside and outside, between my mind and the cosmos, had blurred entirely. The entity was here, within me, around me, demanding an answer. A fractured will, indeed. There was only one path left that resonated with the ghost of the man I had been, the man who had dedicated his life to understanding, to sharing knowledge, however terrifying. I would warn them. The decision solidified, not with a triumphant surge of defiance, but with a weary, desperate resolve. It was a choice born of the deepest, most primal fear of utter annihilation, coupled with a stubborn, almost suicidal hope. My lips parted, and a sound emerged, not a scream, but a distorted, guttural laugh. It echoed through the vast, empty space of the railway depot, a testament to a sanity stretched past breaking, yet still clinging to a sliver of purpose. I had to find a way. I had to tell them. Even if they would never understand. Even if it meant my final descent into the very madness I fought. I would try. The world needed to know. The cosmos was not empty. It was calling. And it was hungry. How to convey the truth? What fragments of my sanity could I still grasp to construct a message, a testament, a final, terrifying warning? My hands, trembling not from fear but from the sheer proximity of what I had sought, clutched the worn leather journal, its pages filled with the frantic scrawl of forgotten scholars, their warnings echoing the rhythmic pulse I now felt in my own chest. The signal. It was here, within these echoing walls, a resonance that vibrated through the very girders above me, through the cracked concrete beneath my feet. My eyes, once accustomed to the ordered geometry of the universe, now saw the chaos within the structure of the depot, the rust patterns on the iron formed intricate, repeating fractals that mirrored the impossible data streams I had collected. Each rivet, each discarded bolt, was a node in an infinite, unknowable network. I had come here, drawn by a compulsion stronger than any scientific curiosity, by a calling that had burrowed deep into my psyche. The historical accounts, dismissed as madness, had spoken of places like this, the forgotten transit points, thresholds where the veil between what was known and what is became impossibly thin. My breath hitched. It was not merely hearing the signal now, I was feeling it, becoming it. The world around me, once solid, began to ripple. My own voice sounded alien, thin against the immense thrumming. It's not just out there. The colossal scale of the depot began to distort. The ceiling, once a distant canopy of steel and glass, seemed to recede into an infinite blackness, stars, not of our galaxy, blooming and fading in silent explosions of light. And within that impossible expanse, a form began to coalesce. Not a shape I could comprehend with terrestrial vision, but a vastness, an entity woven from cosmic indifference and ancient starlight. It was not alien in the way a creature from another planet might be, it was alien to existence itself, a presence that predated the very concept of form. I had opened the door, not just to a new understanding, but to an ultimate dissolution. A wave of pure, unfiltered knowledge crashed over me, not in words or images, but in a raw, overwhelming surge of being. It was all a prelude, a slow, deliberate assimilation. My sanity, long frayed, snapped with the sound of a taut string. I felt my individual consciousness, that fragile construct of memories and desires, begin to unravel, to stretch thin, to become porous. The I that was Blake Mortimer, astrophysicist, was dissolving, merging with the immense, indifferent awareness that now filled the depot. My body, once mine, became a mere vessel, a conduit. The echoes of forgotten journeys were no longer distant sounds but memories, vast and ancient, flowing through me. I was the depot, I was the pulse, I was the infinite blackness between the impossible stars. Then, the final consequence. The subtle alteration to the world. It wasn't a cataclysm, not a sudden, violent end. It was far more insidious. I felt the pulse, now emanating from me, spreading outward, a silent tremor through the world. The mundane objects, the discarded debris, the very air of the depot, began to hum with a faint, almost imperceptible resonance. They were there, just beneath the surface of normal perception, waiting. I was no longer Blake Mortimer. My eyes, no longer seeing with human vision, perceived the world as a tapestry of infinite, overlapping realities, all humming with the same, rhythmic pulse. The entity hadn't vanished, it had simply expanded, becoming the new normal, a pervasive, unacknowledged truth. And I, the brilliant but reclusive astrophysicist, was its first, quiet anchor in a world that would never truly know what had just begun. And the song had just begun.